The light over the kitchen table had been flickering for 3 weeks before Helen Whitfield finally noticed it had stopped. She sat in the same chair she had sat in every morning for 31 years, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, and stared at the small yellow square of paper Frank had left under the salt shaker. The handwriting was his, cramped, slanted, the letters pressing too hard into the page. The way, if you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. They always did when his hand had been tired from a day under hoods and inside engine wells. 4 words and a name. Marlow's Pawn. Adam Street. She had read it 40 times since the night the police came to the door, since the call from St. Vincent's that told her Frank had collapsed on the shop floor at 6:20, since the nurse with kind eyes had explained that his heart had given out before he ever reached the ambulance. 40 times, and the words still meant nothing to her. The house was quiet in the way that only a house can be quiet after 30 years of someone else's footsteps. Frank had not been a loud man. He had not whistled or sung or filled rooms with chatter the way some husbands did. But he had moved. The creak of the 3rd step on the stairs at 5:15 every weekday morning. The soft cough at the kitchen sink while he rinsed his coffee mug. The slow groan of the front door as he pulled it shut behind him. The little sounds of a man going to work. Helen had not understood, in all those years, how much of her own life had been measured against those sounds. Now they were gone, and the silence pressed against her ears like cold water. She turned the note over in her fingers. The paper was the cheap kind Frank kept in his coveralls, a tiny notepad with a wire spiral at the top that he used to write down part numbers and customer phone numbers. The corner of this one was darkened by a thumbprint of grease. She had found it on the kitchen table the morning after he died, weighted down by the salt shaker she had bought 20 years ago at a yard sale in Marion. He must have put it there the night before, after coming home from his shift, after eating the chicken she had made him without saying much about it, after sitting in his recliner for 40 minutes watching a baseball game with the sound turned almost all the way down. He had walked past her to the bedroom and kissed her on the top of the head, the way he always did, and said, "See you tomorrow, honey." And he had gone to bed, and gotten up before sunrise, and gone to the shop, and died there at the age of 59 without ever telling her what the note meant. Helen was 58. She had married Frank when she was 27, in a small ceremony at the courthouse with 2 witnesses, both of them Frank's friends from the Navy, because her own family had not approved. They had still not approved, in their way, for the 31 years that followed. Her mother had died not speaking to her. Her brother sent Christmas cards, but never visited. Her sister-in-law on Frank's side, a woman named Linda who managed a real estate office in Cincinnati, had taken every opportunity over 3 decades to remind Helen that she had married down. Frank had been a mechanic, a small, quiet man with grease-stained fingernails and a high school diploma he barely finished. The Whitfields had wanted him to be a teacher, the way his older brother had become an accountant, the way his younger sister had become a nurse. But Frank had loved engines, and Frank had been good with engines, and Frank had refused, with the particular gentle stubbornness he reserved for things that mattered to him, to become anything else. Helen had loved that about him. She had loved it from the first night they met, at a diner where she had been waitressing, when he had come in after closing time with motor oil on his sleeve and ordered coffee black and apologized for being there so late. She had loved it through every cold winter when his hands cracked from solvent and every summer when his neck burned from the bay door sun. She had loved it through the years when they could not afford a vacation, through the years when they could not afford to fix the upstairs bathroom, through the years when Linda showed up at family Thanksgivings in Kashmir and asked Helen about her hourly wage. Frank had never apologized for what he was. Helen had never wanted him to. But now Frank was gone, and Helen was sitting at the kitchen table looking at a yellow piece of paper, and the world she had built around him was beginning to come apart in ways she had not expected. The first crack had come 2 days after the funeral, when she had gone to the bank to ask about Frank's account. The young woman at the desk had been polite. She had looked at her screen for a long time. She had asked Helen if she was sure she had the right account number. And then she had told Helen, in a voice she kept carefully neutral, that the checking account contained $411 and that the savings account, which Helen had believed for years contained somewhere around $15,000, in fact contained $187. Helen had thought there must be some mistake. She had asked to speak to a manager. The manager, an older woman with reading glasses pushed up into her hair, had pulled the records and shown them to her on a screen. Withdrawals every other Friday for the past 9 years. Small ones at first, $200 for 100. Then larger ones, 1,000, 2,000. The most recent had been 3 weeks before Frank died. $2,000 in cash, withdrawn at the branch on Sycamore, the branch nowhere near Frank's shop. Helen had stared at the screen and felt something cold begin to crawl up her chest. "Is this your husband's signature on the slip?" the manager had asked. It was. Helen knew Frank's signature better than she knew her own. She had driven home with her hands shaking on the wheel. She had sat in the driveway for 20 minutes before she could make herself go inside. And when she finally walked into the kitchen and saw the yellow note still sitting under the salt shaker where she had left it, the words had taken on a new and terrible weight. Marlow's pawn. Adams Street. A pawn shop. Frank had been pawning things. Frank had been withdrawing money. Frank had been doing something she did not know about for 9 years, and he had died before he could tell her what. She had thought at first that he must have had a gambling problem. It was the obvious explanation, the kind of thing a man might hide from his wife, the kind of thing that could drain a savings account over years. But Frank had not been a gambler. Frank had not been to a casino in his life. He had never bought a lottery ticket. He had thought card games were a waste of time. The man Helen had lived with for 31 years could not, in any version of reality she could construct, have lost $15,000 at cards. Then she had thought, with a sickness in her stomach she did not want to acknowledge, that he must have had another woman. The Friday withdrawals. The cash. The location she did not know about. She had sat on the edge of the bed in their bedroom and looked at his side of the closet, at the 4 work shirts hanging in a row and the one good jacket he wore to weddings. And she had tried to picture him meeting someone in a hotel, buying gifts, paying for someone else's life. The image would not form. She had been with Frank for too long. She knew the way he ate his eggs and the way he tied his shoes and the way he sighed when he was tired, and none of it allowed for another woman. He did not have the capacity for it. He did not even have the time. Whatever Frank had been doing, it was something else. And the only piece of evidence she had was the note he had left for her on the table the night before he died. As if he had known something was about to happen. As if he had wanted to make sure that if he did not come home, she would know where to go. The phone rang. Helen jumped, the cold coffee sloshing against the rim of the cup. She let it ring 3 times before she answered. "Helen, it's Linda." Of course it was Linda. Linda had been calling almost every day since the funeral, ostensibly to check on her. In reality, to make small, careful inquiries about Frank's affairs. She wanted to know if Frank had a will, which he had. She wanted to know if Frank had any life insurance, which he had not, because Frank had said for years that life insurance was a scam designed to take money from working men. She wanted to know what Helen was planning to do with the house, the car, the tools in the garage. The questions came wrapped in concern, but Helen had been listening to Linda for 31 years, and she knew the difference between concern and inventory. "I'm fine, Linda. I'm just sitting down for breakfast." At 10 in the morning? It's been a slow morning. There was a small pause on the other end of the line. Helen could hear Linda choosing her next words. "Robert and I were talking last night. About Frank's things. We thought maybe we could come down this weekend and help you go through the garage. You shouldn't have to do all of that alone." Robert was Frank's older brother. The accountant. The one who had not come to a Sunday dinner in 15 years, but had appeared at the funeral in a black suit that had clearly been bought for the occasion. He had spoken about Frank as if Frank had been a man he barely knew, which was, in some ways, the truth. "I appreciate that, but I'm going to take my time with it. Helen, the longer you wait, the harder it gets. I know. There are things that have value. Tools, equipment. Robert can give you an appraisal. We don't want you to be taken advantage of by some scrap dealer." "I'm not going to call a scrap dealer, Linda." Another pause. Linda's voice came back softer, more careful. "Sweetheart, we just want to help. You haven't worked in years. You and Frank didn't have any savings to speak of. We're worried about you." The words sat in Helen's chest like swallowed stones. We didn't have any savings to speak of. Linda did not know about the missing $15,000. Linda did not know about the bank manager's screen with its long list of Friday withdrawals. Linda assumed, as everyone in the Whitfield family had always assumed, that Frank and Helen had been one step from poverty for their entire marriage. And the worst part was that Helen was no longer sure she could prove them wrong. "I'll call you back, Linda. Someone's at the door." Helen, she hung up. There was, of course, no one at the door. She stood in the kitchen with her hand still on the receiver and looked again at the yellow note. Marlow's Pawn, Adams Street. The address she had not yet looked up. The place she had not yet been. She had been telling herself for 9 days that she was not ready, that she needed to grieve first, that she needed to handle the practical things first, that she needed time. But the truth was simpler than any of those things. The truth was that she was afraid of what she would find. If Frank had been pawning things, what had he been pawning? They had nothing of value. Their wedding rings were plain gold bands they had bought at a department store. The watch Helen wore had been her grandmother's and was not worth much. Frank's tools were valuable, but the tools were still in the garage. She had checked. Every wrench, every socket set, every piece of his life's labor was still hanging in its place above his workbench. He had not been pawning his tools. So what had he been doing at a pawn shop every other Friday for 9 years? She made a decision then, the kind of decision that arrives without announcement, the kind that you do not realize you have made until you are already moving toward it. She went to the bedroom and put on a clean blouse. She brushed her hair. She put on the small pearl earrings Frank had given her for their 25th anniversary, which she had not worn since the funeral. She found her purse where she had thrown it on the dresser. She found the keys to Frank's truck because the car was low on gas and she could not afford to fill it. She walked out the front door into a cold gray morning that smelled of wet leaves, and she got into the truck and looked at the yellow note one more time, and she pulled out of the driveway without looking back. Adams Street ran along the eastern edge of the city, through a part of town Helen had not driven through in years. It had once been industrial. The river ran behind it, and the warehouses along the water had been full when she was young, full of men in canvas jackets unloading trucks at 4 in the morning, full of the low rumble of forklifts and the smell of diesel. The warehouses were mostly empty now. Some had been turned into lofts for people who wanted to live in old brick buildings with exposed pipes. Others had simply been left to rust. The street between them was cracked, and weeds grew up through the cracks, and the streetlights that still worked stood at uneven intervals like teeth in an old mouth. Marlow's Pawn was at the south end, near the bend where the road curved away from the river. The sign was painted on a wooden board that hung from 2 chains above a doorway, and the paint had been bleached by sun and rain until the letters were barely legible. The window beside the door was covered in a heavy iron grate. Behind the grate, Helen could see a dusty display of guitars and watches and an old saxophone whose brass had gone dull. A small placard in the corner of the window said "Open" in faded red letters. She sat in the truck for a long time with the engine running. She watched the door. No one went in. No one came out. The street was empty except for a man at the far corner pushing a shopping cart full of cans. After 15 minutes, Helen turned off the engine. She took the yellow note out of her purse. She held it in her left hand the way she had been holding it for 9 days, and she walked to the door and pushed it open. A bell rang somewhere above her head, a small clear sound that seemed too cheerful for the room she had stepped into. The shop was longer than she had expected and dimmer. Glass cases ran along both walls, full of objects she did not have time to look at properly. Rings and necklaces and pocket watches, cameras, a violin in a velvet-lined case, a row of pistols laid out like silverware. The air smelled of old wood and pipe tobacco and something else, something faint and metallic she could not place. At the far end of the shop, behind a wooden counter that was nearly black with age, an old man sat reading a book under a green-shaded lamp. He looked up when the bell rang. He was perhaps 70, with a full head of white hair and a neat white beard, and he wore a brown cardigan over a button-down shirt. His face was lined the way faces get lined by weather and not by worry. When he saw Helen, he closed his book slowly, and Helen saw that something passed across his expression. Not surprise. Recognition. "You must be Mrs. Whitfield," he said. Helen stopped in the middle of the shop. The yellow note was suddenly damp in her fingers. "How do you know that?" The old man stood up. He moved without hurry, the way old men move when they have learned that there is no point in hurrying, and he came around the side of the counter and stood looking at her with his hands clasped in front of him. "Frank described you to me once. He said you had brown hair you wore short and pearl earrings, and that you stood very straight even when you were tired. He said I would know you the minute I saw you." He paused. "I'm sorry about Frank, Mrs. Whitfield. He was a fine man, one of the finest I ever knew." Helen felt her knees go soft. She put a hand on the nearest glass case to steady herself. and the old man saw it and moved a wooden stool toward her without making her ask. She sat down. She did not trust herself to speak yet. The old man waited patiently, watching her with the kind of quiet attention that Frank had sometimes given her at the kitchen table. "You knew my husband," she finally said. "For 31 years. 31 years. He started coming in here a few months after the two of you were married." The old man smiled, a slow, tired, kind smile. "I remember because he told me about you on his first visit. He sat right there on that stool and told me he had married a woman who was too good for him and that he was going to spend the rest of his life trying to deserve her. I have heard a lot of men say a lot of foolish things in this shop, Mrs. Whitfield, but I have never heard one of them say it the way Frank said it." Helen could not speak. The tears came so fast that they were on her cheeks before she knew they were in her eyes, and she did not try to wipe them away. The old man took a folded handkerchief out of his pocket and handed it to her without comment. He turned away to give her privacy, walked back behind his counter, and busied himself with the lamp until she had gathered herself. When she could finally speak, her voice was thin. "I don't know why I'm here. You're here because Frank wanted you to be. I found a note. He left it on the kitchen table the night before he died. It only said your shop and the street." The old man nodded as if this confirmed something he had already known. "My name is Albert Marlow. I owned this shop with my brother for 40 years, and I have run it alone for the last 12. Your husband was a customer. He was also, in a way that came to mean a great deal to me, my friend." Albert stopped. He looked at Helen for a long moment, as if measuring something. "Mrs. Whitfield, before we go any further, I have to ask you something. And I have to ask you to answer it honestly, because what comes after depends on it." "All right. Did Frank ever talk to you about the boxes?" Helen stared at him. "The boxes?" "Yes." "No," she said. "He never said anything about any boxes." Albert nodded again, slowly. He seemed neither surprised nor disappointed. He seemed, in fact, to have expected this answer. "Then I think you had better come into the back," he said. "And I think you had better sit down for what I have to tell you." Helen followed him through a curtain of red fabric that hung at the rear of the shop. Beyond it was a small room with a work table under a single hanging bulb, and beyond that, set into the rear wall, was a door bound in steel. Albert took a ring of keys from his pocket. He selected one that looked older than the others, and he turned it in the lock, and the door swung open into a room that Helen had not been prepared for. It was not a room at all, in the ordinary sense. It was a vault. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with metal drawers, each one numbered, each one set with a small brass plate. 3 rows of them on each wall, and the room extended perhaps 15 feet deep. In the center stood a long wooden table on which a single small lamp burned. Albert stood aside and let her look. Helen stood in the doorway with her hand pressed to her mouth. "What is this?" she said. "This is the back room of Marlow's pawn, Mrs. Whitfield. My grandfather built it in 1934. The vault itself is from a bank that closed during the Depression. My grandfather bought it for almost nothing and had it installed in this building when he opened the shop. For 3 generations, my family has used this room to hold what we call long-term consignments. Items that customers do not wish to sell, but do not wish to keep in their own homes. Items they trust us to protect for them." He walked into the room and stopped beside the 3rd drawer in the 2nd row on the left wall. He turned and looked at Helen. "This is your husband's drawer," he said. Helen could not move. She stood in the doorway and looked at the small brass plate on the front of the drawer, and she could see, even from where she stood, that there was a number engraved on it. 212. "Frank rented this drawer in the spring of 1995, Albert said. He paid the rental fee for the first year in cash. He has paid it in cash, every May, for 30 years. He never told me why he was keeping things in it, and I never asked, because that is not a question my family asks. But he came here once every 2 weeks for most of those 30 years, and what he brought with him each time he placed inside this drawer, and what he placed inside this drawer is what is still inside it now." Helen finally took a step into the room. "What's in it?" Albert looked at her with eyes that were not pitying and not unkind, but simply steady. "That, Mrs. Whitfield, is for you to find out. The drawer is yours now. Frank made arrangements for that years ago. There is a key, and there is also a combination, and only you can open it. But I cannot open it for you. Frank was very specific. He said his wife would come in her own time, and that when she came, she was to do it alone." He turned and walked past her, out of the vault, back through the curtain into the front of the shop. He left her standing in front of drawer number 212 with the yellow note still clutched in her left hand. And she could hear, from the front of the shop, the small ordinary sound of him sitting down at his desk and turning a page in his book, as if he had not just shown her a wall full of secrets. Helen stood there for a long time. She did not know what she was about to do. She did not know what she was about to find. She knew only that Frank had been coming here every other Friday for 30 years, and that whatever he had been doing in this room was about to become her inheritance, for better or for worse. She put her hand on the drawer. The metal was cold under her fingers. Beside the brass number plate was a small keyhole and a tiny combination dial, for numbers on a ring no larger than a coat button. She did not have the key. She did not have the combination. She would have to go home and look for them, and she did not know where Frank would have hidden such things in a house she thought she knew completely. But she also knew, standing there with her palm against drawer 212, that she was no longer the woman who had sat at the kitchen table that morning. She had stepped, in the last 20 minutes, across a threshold she could not step back over. Her husband had kept a secret from her for 30 years, and the secret had a number, and the number was waiting for her to find out what it meant. She walked slowly out of the vault. Albert was at his desk, exactly as she had heard him be. He did not look up when she came through the curtain. He waited until she stood across from him at the counter, and then he closed his book again, and he said, "Did you find what you needed to find today?" "I don't have the key," Helen said. "I don't have the combination. Frank kept them at home." "Where at home?" Albert smiled, a smaller smile than before, almost private. "He told me once that the woman who knew where he kept his most important things would also know how to find them when she needed to. He had great faith in that, Mrs. Whitfield." Helen looked at him. "He had more faith in me than I had in him." "No," Albert said gently. "You had faith in each other. You just didn't know all the ways that he had faith in you." She did not cry again, though she felt the tears very close. She gathered herself. She straightened the strap of her purse on her shoulder. She thanked Albert in a voice that did not entirely sound like her own, and she turned to leave the shop. At the door, she stopped. She looked back. "Mr. Marlow." "Yes, Mrs. Whitfield. Can you tell me anything about what's in there?" "Anything at all." Albert considered her for a long moment. He looked at the curtain that led to the back of the shop. He looked at his own folded hands on the counter. And then he looked at Helen, and his voice when he spoke was very quiet. "I can tell you only this. Your husband was a careful man. He was not a man who acted without thought. And whatever he placed in that drawer over 30 years, he placed there because he loved you, and because he wanted to make sure that one day, when he was no longer able to take care of you himself, you would not be left with nothing." Helen left the shop. The cold air hit her face like water. She sat in the truck for a long time before she could make her hand turn the key in the ignition, and when she finally pulled away from the curb, she did not drive home. She drove instead to the lookout above the river, where Frank used to take her on Sunday afternoons when they were first married, and she parked the truck and sat behind the wheel and looked at the gray water sliding past the empty warehouses, and she let herself cry for the second time that day. She cried not because Frank was dead. She had cried for that already, in the funeral home and in the bedroom and in the shower at 3 in the morning. She cried now because for 9 days she had been telling herself that her husband had been hiding something terrible from her, and standing in that vault, she had understood that it was the opposite. He had been hiding something good. He had been hiding it for 30 years. And he had been hiding it because he had loved her too much to make her worry about it while he was alive, and he had wanted her to find it only when she needed it most. She drove home in the late afternoon. The light through the windshield was the color of old gold. She let herself into the house she had shared with Frank for 31 years, and she stood in the front hall and looked at it as if she had never seen it before. The coats on the hooks by the door. The framed photographs on the wall above the staircase. The umbrella stand with the chipped paint. Somewhere in this house, Frank had hidden a key. Somewhere in this house, Frank had hidden a 4-digit number. And he had believed, with the calm certainty of a man who had spent his life understanding mechanical things, that his wife would know how to find both. She started in the bedroom. She went through the dresser drawer by drawer, beginning with his side, working slowly, lifting each item out, checking pockets, feeling along the wooden bottom for any seam she had not noticed before. She found a tie clip from his Navy days. She found a folded photograph of his mother. She found a screwdriver, of all things, that he had apparently been using to fix the back of the dresser and had simply forgotten to take downstairs. She did not find a key. She moved to the closet. She went through his pockets, every pair of pants, every jacket. She felt the lining of his good winter coat, the one he had worn to her brother's wedding. She found loose change and a packet of breath mints and a receipt from a hardware store dated 2 years ago. She did not find a key. She moved to the bathroom, the linen closet, the kitchen drawers. She moved down to the basement, where Frank had a small workbench he used for household repairs, and she went through every coffee can full of screws and every plastic bin of electrical tape and every shelf of paint cans and turpentine. She did not find a key. By 8 o'clock that night, she was sitting on the floor of the garage, surrounded by Frank's tools, weeping with frustration. She had searched the house, and she had not found anything. And the more she searched, the more she had begun to doubt herself. The more she had begun to think that Albert Marlow had been wrong, that Frank had not believed in her after all, that the key was hidden somewhere she would never think to look, that she would die in this house an old woman who had never found out what was in drawer 212. She put her hand on the leg of Frank's workbench to push herself up off the floor. The bench was an old wooden thing he had built himself, 20 years ago, out of 2x4s and a slab of plywood he had brought home from somewhere. The legs were rough, never sanded. She had told him 100 times that he should plane them down before she got a splinter from them. He had said 100 times that he would. Her fingers brushed against something on the underside of the leg, something cool and metallic, something that should not have been there. Helen stopped. She went very still. Then, very slowly, she lay down on her back on the cold concrete floor of the garage, and she looked up at the underside of the workbench, and there, taped to the inner face of the back left leg with electrical tape that had been carefully applied in 3 precise strips, was a small brass key and a folded square of paper. She lay there for a moment without moving. The garage smelled of motor oil and sawdust. Above her, Frank's tools hung on their pegboard, exactly where he had left them. She reached up and pulled the tape away. The key came loose. The paper came with it. She sat up slowly, holding both of them, and she unfolded the paper under the bare bulb of the garage light. On it, in Frank's cramped handwriting, were 4 numbers. Below them was a single line. For you. For everything. F. Helen Whitfield sat on the concrete floor of her garage with a brass key in one hand and her husband's last message in the other, and she understood, finally, that she had only just begun to find out what kind of man she had been married to. She did not go back to the pawnshop that night. She thought about it. She sat at the kitchen table with the key and the paper laid out in front of her, and the cup of coffee she had poured at noon still sitting there untouched, and she thought about driving back down to Adams Street and pounding on Albert Marlow's door and demanding to be let in. But Albert had told her she had to do it alone, and Albert had told her that Frank had been very specific about it, and Helen had been listening to her husband for 31 years even when he was not speaking. She knew what he would have wanted. He would have wanted her to do this in daylight, with her wits about her, with no anger in her hands. So she put the key in a small zippered pocket inside her purse, and she put the paper into the breast pocket of the cardigan she was wearing, and she made herself a piece of toast that she did not eat, and she went to bed. She did not sleep. She lay on her side of the bed and looked at the empty pillow beside her, and she went over every memory of Frank she had, looking for the moments she must have missed. The afternoon 9 years ago when he had come home with grease on the knees of his pants and a strange quiet in his eyes. The Christmas when he had not bought her a present and had apologized with such embarrassment that she had told him not to worry, that being together was enough. The summer he had taken on extra shifts at the shop, 14-hour days, 6 days a week, until she had begged him to stop. He had said only that there was something he needed to take care of. He had not told her what. She had not asked, because Frank did not lie, and if he could not tell her, she had trusted that there was a reason. She had trusted him for 31 years, and he had repaid that trust with a key taped to the underside of a workbench. She thought, lying in the dark, that she had never loved him more than she did in that moment. In the morning, she made herself eat. She made eggs and toast, and ate them slowly at the kitchen table, and she drank a full cup of fresh coffee, and she put on the same clothes she had worn the day before, because they were already clean and because she did not have the energy to choose new ones. She did her hair in the bathroom mirror and looked at her own face. 58 years old. Brown hair shot through with gray at the temples. A face that had not been pretty in any conventional way even when she was young, but which Frank had told her every single anniversary was the most beautiful face he had ever seen. She had laughed at him every time. She wished, now, that she had let herself believe him. The phone rang while she was rinsing her plate. She let the machine take it. Linda's voice came on, a little sharper than the day before, asking why Helen had not called her back, asking if Helen was all right, asking if Helen had given any more thought to the conversation about Robert coming down to help with the garage. Helen turned off the volume on the machine and pulled her keys off the hook by the door. She drove to Adams Street the same way she had the day before, down the same streets, past the same boarded windows. The morning was clearer than yesterday. A wash of pale sun lay across the river, and the warehouses on the far side glowed faintly orange where the bricks caught the light. She parked across from Marlow's pawn. She sat in the truck for a minute, just 1 minute, the way she had told herself she would. Then she got out. The bell rang above the door. Albert was at his desk again, reading the same book. He looked up. He smiled when he saw her, and Helen saw something in his face she had not noticed the day before, a kind of weight that lifted just slightly. He had been waiting for her. He had perhaps been waiting for her, in some quiet way, for years. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "I found them. I thought you might." He stood and came around the counter, and he went to the front door and turned the latch and flipped a small sign in the window from open to closed. And then he came back and walked her through the curtain, without saying anything more. They stopped in front of drawer 212. Albert took a step back and folded his hands in front of him. "I'll be in the front of the shop," he said. "Take as long as you need. There is a chair by the table. There is a lamp. If you require anything, you have only to call." He left her there. Helen heard the curtain fall closed behind him. She was alone in the vault with the lamp on the table burning its small yellow circle and the wall of drawers rising around her like the doors of so many other lives. She took the key out of her purse. She unfolded the paper. She read the 4 numbers Frank had written there, and she dialed them slowly on the little combination ring beside the keyhole, 1 click at a time, as if she were turning back a clock. The dial caught on the 4th number. She slid the key into the keyhole. She turned it. The drawer opened with a soft mechanical sigh, the sound of well-oiled hinges that had been opened and closed for 30 years. Inside, on a bed of black felt, were envelopes. Many of them, stacked carefully, edges aligned, the way Frank had aligned every screw in every drawer of his toolbox. They were the kind of plain manila envelopes you bought at the drugstore, none of them labeled on the outside. There must have been 40 or 50 of them in the drawer, more than would fit in any of the cubby holes in the kitchen, more than she had imagined a drawer this size could hold. She did not touch them at first. She stood looking at them as if they might disappear if she reached for them too quickly. Then she lifted the top one out. She carried it to the wooden table at the center of the vault. She sat down on the chair Albert had set there. She undid the small metal clasp at the back of the envelope, and she slid out, onto the table, 3 sheets of paper. The first was a receipt from a coin dealer in Cleveland, dated September 14, 1995. It listed a single item, 1/1916 standing Liberty quarter, choice uncirculated, full head. The price was $970. The second was a small card in a clear plastic sleeve, professionally graded, with the same quarter sealed inside. The face of the coin was clean. The reverse showed a bald eagle with its wings spread. The third was a single piece of notebook paper, in Frank's handwriting, that said, "For our anniversary. I couldn't afford to buy you the diamond ring you should have had. So I bought you this instead, and I'll buy you one more every year until I run out of time. Each one will be worth more by the time you find them. They will all be yours." Helen put the paper down. She put her hands flat on the table. She stared at the small graded coin in its plastic sleeve, at the date 1916, at the careful preservation of an object that had survived nearly 80 years before it had come into her husband's hands. She sat there for a long time. Then she reached for the second envelope. It was the same. A receipt. A coin in a sleeve. A note in Frank's handwriting. This one was a 1901 S. Barber quarter. The receipt was dated September 1996. The note said, "Year 2. You are still too good for me. F." The third was a 1932 D. Washington quarter. The fourth, an 1872 seeded Liberty quarter. The fifth, a Carson City Morgan dollar from 1893, and the receipt for that one was for $9,000, and Helen's hands began to shake when she saw the figure, because she remembered the year. 1999, the year Frank had taken on the extra shifts. The year he had worked himself nearly to collapse and had refused to tell her why. She kept going. She opened the 6th envelope, the 7th, the 10th. Each one was a coin. Each one was a receipt. Each one was a small note in Frank's handwriting, sometimes only a few words, sometimes longer. By the 15th envelope, the receipts were for $2,000, for 1,006. By the 25th, she had to stop because she could not see the paper through her tears. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and made herself keep going. There was no order she could discern beyond the obvious chronology of the dates. Frank had not been buying a set. He had not been completing a collection. He had been buying, each year for 30 years, a single coin that some old book or some advisor had told him would hold its value or grow in it. And he had been buying them one at a time, when he could afford them, with the money he had saved from his Friday paychecks. The note in the 17th envelope, from 2011, said, "This one nearly broke me. But you wore that blue dress last week, and I thought, she deserves more than I can give her. So I went and got more." The note in the 22nd envelope, from 2016, said, "Doctor told me about my heart today. I am going to keep doing this for as long as I can. If you are reading this, I either ran out of time or I changed my mind, and I am sitting next to you while you open them. Please God, let it be the second one." Helen had to put her head down on the table. She wept openly, without sound, the way a person weeps when they have been alone in a room for a long time. She wept for the years Frank had been buying these coins and not telling her. She wept for the doctor's appointment in 2016 that he had hidden from her, the heart condition he had carried for 7 years without a single word, the way he must have lived with that knowledge every day while smiling at her over breakfast and kissing the top of her head on his way to bed. She wept because she understood, finally, what the Friday withdrawals had been for and what the missing $15,000 in their savings account meant, and why Frank had eaten leftovers for lunch every day of his working life and never bought himself a new pair of work boots until the soles came off the old ones. He had been saving for her. He had been saving for 30 years. He had been saving in a way that Linda and Robert would never have understood, in a way that even the bank would not have recognized as savings, because Frank had not trusted banks, and Frank had not trusted the stock market, and Frank had not trusted any of the things that the Whitfield family with their accountancy and their real estate had spent their whole lives trusting. He had trusted small things made of silver and gold. He had trusted that they would still be worth what they were worth, or more, when the day came that she needed them. The day had come, and she did not yet know what they were worth, not really. She did not know whether the drawer in front of her held $5,000 or $50,000 or more. But she knew, with a certainty that filled her chest like air after a long dive, that her husband had not been a poor man. She knew that the world's measurement of him had been wrong all along. She knew, looking at the envelopes spread across the wooden table, that Frank Whitfield, mechanic, high school graduate, who had been condescended to and pitted for 3 decades by his own family, had been quietly, patiently, lovingly building a fortune for his wife with the only resources he had, time and discipline and the dim, stubborn faith that things made of precious metal held their value when nothing else did. She did not open all of the envelopes that day. She opened 30 of them. She stopped because her eyes hurt and her hands had begun to ache, and because, even more than that, she could not bear to take in any more of him at once. She carefully replaced each coin in its envelope and each envelope in the drawer. She closed the drawer and turned the key and reset the combination. She put the key back into the zippered pocket of her purse. She walked through the curtain into the front of the shop, where Albert Marlow was reading his book under the green-shaded lamp, and she stood at the counter until he looked up. "Did you find what he wanted you to find?" he asked. Helen could not speak. She nodded. "Mrs. Whitfield, I want to tell you something. I know this is not the right moment, but I want you to know it before you go home tonight. Your husband and I talked many times over the years about what was in that drawer. He never told me a number. He never told me a total. But he showed me a list once of what he had bought, and he asked me my opinion as to whether he had chosen well. I told him then, and I will tell you now, that he had chosen exceptionally well. The coins in that drawer, by my estimate, are worth a great deal of money. More than I think you are prepared to hear today. I would not tell you a figure now even if you asked me, because the figure is not the point, and because the figure needs to be confirmed by someone who knows more than I do. But I want you to understand, before you walk out of this shop, that what you have inherited is not a curiosity. It is a fortune, and the man who built it for you spent 30 years of his life doing it. Helen put a hand on the counter. The shop seemed to tilt very slightly around her. Albert moved as if to catch her elbow, but she steadied herself. "How much?" she said. "Mrs. Whitfield." "How much, Mr. Marlow? Please." Albert looked at her for a long moment. "I am not a coin appraiser," he said. "I deal in pawned items, and I know enough to know my own limits. But I have a friend who is one of the best numismatic appraisers in the country. He works out of an office in Philadelphia. I have already taken the liberty, with Frank's permission given years ago, of arranging for him to come and look at the drawer when the time was right. I called him this morning, after you left yesterday. He will be here on Thursday. He has agreed to do the appraisal in person, in this shop, in your presence." What did Frank think they were worth? He thought the last time we spoke of it, for years ago, that they would be worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $2.5 million. The number landed in the room like a stone dropped into water. Helen heard it. She heard it, and she did not believe it, and she heard it again, and she did believe it, and she stood with her hand on the counter and tried to feel her own legs. $2.5 million. For years ago. The coin market has appreciated considerably since then. My friend will give you the current valuation on Thursday, but it will not be less than what your husband estimated, Mrs. Whitfield. It will likely be substantially more. Helen did not speak again for a long time. Albert poured her a small glass of water from a pitcher he kept under the counter. She drank it. She set the glass down. She looked at the old man across from her, and she said, in a voice that was much quieter than the one she had been using all morning, "Thank you, Mr. Marlow. Thank you for what you have done for him, and for me. Frank was the friend, Mrs. Whitfield. I was just the keeper of his drawer." She left the shop. She drove home in a state she could not properly describe to herself, somewhere between weeping and laughter, somewhere between disbelief and a calm so deep it felt like sleep. She did not turn on the radio. She did not check her phone. She drove past her own house once before she realized she had driven past it, and she had to turn around at the end of the block and come back. When she pulled into the driveway, a black sedan was parked in front of the mailbox. Helen recognized it before she had fully stopped. It was Linda's car. Linda was sitting in the driver's seat with her hands on the wheel, watching the front door of the house, as if waiting for Helen to come out of it. When Helen pulled in behind her, Linda got out of the car immediately, and the expression on Linda's face was not concern, and it was not friendliness, and it was not anything Helen had seen on Linda's face in 31 years. It was suspicion. "Helen," Linda said, "where have you been?" Helen got out of the truck slowly. She kept her purse close to her side. The key in its zippered pocket seemed to her, suddenly, to be the most important object in the world. "I went for a drive. You've been gone all morning. I needed some air." Linda looked at her for a long moment. Linda's eyes went to the truck. They went to Helen's purse. They went, briefly, to Helen's face, which Helen tried to keep as neutral as she could. "Helen," Linda said, "Robert and I think you should come stay with us in Cincinnati for a few weeks. The house is too much for you right now. There are decisions you shouldn't be making by yourself." "What decisions?" "About Frank's things. About the estate. We're worried that someone might try to take advantage." Helen looked at her sister-in-law, this woman she had known for 3 decades and had never, in all that time, particularly liked. She thought of the drawer in the back room of Marlow's pawn. She thought of the coins inside it. She thought of Frank, who had spent 30 years building something he did not trust his own family to know about, who had hidden it not from her, but for her, who had understood, perhaps better than Helen had understood herself, what would happen when his family heard about it. She smiled at Linda. She smiled the way Frank used to smile when he was being polite to someone he did not respect. "I'll think about it, Linda. Thank you for coming by." She walked past Linda to the front door. She unlocked it. She went inside, and she shut it behind her, and she stood with her back against it and listened until she heard Linda's car start in the driveway and pull away. Then she walked into the kitchen. She sat down at the table, in the same chair where she had been sitting that morning, and she took the brass key out of her purse, and she laid it on the table beside the yellow note that still rested under the salt shaker. Outside, The afternoon light had begun to soften toward evening. Somewhere down the block, a child was calling for a dog. The kitchen was quiet, but it was not the empty quiet it had been the day before. It was the quiet of a house that contained a secret, and the secret was hers now, and she would have to decide, very carefully, what she was going to do with it. She thought of Linda's face in the driveway. She thought of Robert in his black funeral suit. She thought of Albert Marlow telling her that the appraiser was coming Thursday. She thought of Frank, lying somewhere in a hospital morgue drawer 4 days ago, the small note already on the table at home, waiting. She picked up the key. She held it in her palm. It was warm now from her hand. Thursday was 3 days away. She had 3 days to decide who, if anyone, she was going to tell. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the bed she had shared with Frank for 31 years, and she stared at the ceiling and thought about the number Albert Marlow had given her. $2.5 million. Possibly more. The number did not fit inside her head. She had spent her whole adult life calculating in hundreds. The grocery bill, the gas bill, the heating bill in February, the small fund she kept in the kitchen jar for emergencies. The largest amount of money she had ever held in her hands at one time was $900, and that had been the down payment on the second-hand Buick they had bought in 1997, which had broken down 2 years later, and which Frank had cannibalized for parts in the driveway over the course of a long, humid summer. $2.5 million was not a quantity she could feel. It was a quantity she could only think about. She tried to think about what she would do with it. She tried to picture herself spending it. The exercise made her feel guilty in a way she did not entirely understand, as if even the act of imagining was a betrayal of the man who had earned it. So she stopped. She turned over and looked at the empty pillow beside her, and she said, out loud in the dark room, "Frank, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this." There was no answer. The house was silent the way it had been silent every night since he died. But she felt, in a way she could not have explained to anyone, that he had heard her, and that the answer to her question would come if she could only be patient enough to wait for it. In the morning the phone began to ring at 7:15. It was Robert. Helen could hear the difference between Linda's voice on the answering machine and Robert's the moment he started speaking. Linda was sharp and watchful. Robert was slower, more deliberate, the voice of a man who had built his career on the patient management of other people's money. His message was short. "Helen, this is your brother-in-law. Linda told me about her visit yesterday. We are concerned. Please call me back at your earliest convenience." Helen did not call him back. She made coffee. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at the small patch of yard where Frank had grown tomatoes every summer for as long as she could remember. The tomato plants were dead now, their stakes leaning sideways in the brown soil. She thought she would pull them up later in the week. She thought she would replant them in the spring, even though she had never been a gardener, because Frank had wanted them and Frank was not here to keep them, and she did not want to let that part of him die along with the rest. The phone rang again at 9, and again at 10:30, and again at noon. By the third call, Helen had unplugged the machine from the wall and put it in the closet under the stairs. The silence afterward felt like a small victory. She went out to the garage that afternoon. She had not been out there since the night she found the key, and she had not done what she went out there now to do, which was to look. Really look. Frank had hidden one thing in this garage. There was no telling, she thought, whether he had hidden others. The garage was not large. A single car space with the workbench along the back wall, the pegboard above it, 2 rows of metal shelving on the side wall, and a small loft above the door that Frank had built himself out of plywood for storing things he rarely used. Christmas decorations. A rolled-up canvas tent from their camping trip in 1989 that they had never used again. Cardboard boxes of paperwork that Frank had said for years he was going to organize and never had. Helen pulled down the ladder. She climbed up into the loft. The plywood floor was thick with dust, and the air smelled of old cardboard and pine. She moved one box, then another, working through them slowly. Most of them held what she had expected to find. Receipts for tools. Manuals for appliances long since thrown out. A box of birthday cards she had given him over the years, which he had kept every single one of and arranged by date with a rubber band around each year's stack. In the back corner, behind the rolled-up tent, was a small wooden box she had never seen before. It was the size of a large book, made of a dark wood that might have been walnut, with a brass latch on the front and her own initials, H.W., carved into the lid in small precise letters. She lifted it carefully. It was heavier than it looked. She carried it down the ladder and brought it into the kitchen and set it on the table in front of her. The latch was not locked. She opened it. Inside were letters. Frank's handwriting. Each one folded into thirds and tied with the same kind of plain white string he used to tie tomato plants to their stakes. She counted them. There were 31. One for each year of their marriage. She picked up the top one. The string came undone in her fingers. She unfolded the paper, and at the top of the page, in Frank's slanted hand, was a date. October 12, 1994. Their first anniversary. The letter beneath it was short. Helen, I am writing this in case I do not get the chance to tell you everything I want to tell you. I am 28 years old today, and I have been married to you for 1 year, and I do not think I will ever understand why you chose me. I am going to keep writing these letters until I run out of years. If you ever find them, it will mean I am gone. If you never find them, it will mean I told you everything in person. Either way, I love you. F. Helen sat at the kitchen table and read the second letter, and the third, and the fourth. October 12, 1995. October 12, 1996. October 12, 1997. He had been keeping these letters every anniversary for 31 years. He had never told her about them. He had never given her any indication that they existed. They had been sitting in a wooden box in the loft of the garage, with her initials carved into the lid, waiting for her to find them, for as long as they had been married. She read until her eyes blurred. She read about the year he had been laid off from the shop and had not told her because he had not wanted her to worry, and had picked up cash work doing yard maintenance until he found another mechanic job. She read about the year his mother had died, and he had not cried at the funeral and had sat in the bathroom of the funeral home for 40 minutes wondering why he could not cry, and had finally cried in the truck on the drive home with Helen asleep in the passenger seat. She read about the year he had decided to buy the first coin, the year he had walked into Marlow's pawn for the first time on a Friday afternoon in May, the year he had stood at Albert's counter and tried to explain what he wanted and why, and Albert had listened to him without laughing and had said, "Mr. Whitfield, I think we can help each other." She read about the years after that, the coins he had agonized over choosing, the advisors he had consulted, men who knew about numismatics and would not have given a small-town mechanic the time of day except that Frank, in his quiet way, had earned their respect. The year he had bought a coin that turned out to be a forgery and had lost almost $2,000 in a single afternoon, and had been so angry with himself that he had nearly given up. The year after that, when he had taught himself enough about coin grading and authentication to never make that mistake again. By the time she reached the letter for 2016, the year of the doctor's appointment about his heart, the letter she had already known existed because of the note in the 17th envelope at the pawnshop, she had to stop. She could not keep reading. She put the letters back in the box, all of them, and she closed the lid and she sat with her hands on top of it, and she said, "Frank, you old fool. You wonderful old fool." The phone began to ring again from where she had hidden it under the stairs. Helen ignored it. She made herself a sandwich at the kitchen counter, and she ate it slowly, standing up, looking out the window at the dead tomato plants. When she finished, she washed the plate and set it in the rack. She picked up the wooden box and carried it upstairs to the bedroom, and she put it on the dresser where she could see it from the bed. Then she got into bed in the middle of the afternoon, fully clothed, on top of the covers, and she slept for 4 hours. When she woke up, it was almost dark. She turned on the bedside lamp. She lay there for a while, watching the way the light moved across the wooden box on the dresser, and she thought about what she was going to do. She got up. She went downstairs. She plugged the answering machine back into the wall and listened to the messages. There were 11. Most of them were Robert and Linda, increasingly impatient. One was from a woman at the diocese who wanted to talk about a memorial mass. One was from the funeral home about the final paperwork. And one, the last one on the tape, was from a voice Helen did not recognize, a male voice, smooth and professional, that said, "Mrs. Whitfield, my name is Gregory Hahn. I'm an attorney calling on behalf of the Whitfield family. I would appreciate the opportunity to speak with you at your earliest convenience regarding your late husband's estate. Please call me back at the following number." Helen wrote the number down on a piece of paper. She did not call it back. She stood looking at it. For a long time, Frank's family had hired a lawyer. 3 days after his funeral, they had hired a lawyer. She picked up the phone. She dialed the only lawyer she herself knew. which was the one who had handled the closing on their house 22 years ago. The line went to an automated message. The firm was closed. They opened at 9 in the morning. She left a message asking for an appointment as soon as possible, and she said it was urgent. Then she sat at the kitchen table in the dark and waited for morning. Tuesday came in cold and gray. Helen called the lawyer's office at 9:05, and the receptionist told her that Mr. Donnelly had retired 4 years ago, but that his daughter, who had joined the firm, would be happy to see Helen at 11. Helen drove downtown with her hands tied on the wheel. The lawyer's daughter, whose name was Catherine, turned out to be a brisk woman in her early 40s who listened to Helen for 40 minutes without interrupting and then asked her 3 short questions and then said, "Mrs. Whitfield, you need to do exactly what I tell you to do, and you need to do it today." Helen nodded. "Your husband died with a will, which I am going to need a copy of. He named you as the sole beneficiary, which means no one else has standing to contest the estate without proving fraud or undue influence, neither of which can be proven because he made the will 11 years ago and you were not involved in its execution. The pawnshop arrangement is more complicated, but only because we will need to make sure that the chain of ownership is documented, that the coins were purchased with marital funds, and that the items themselves are properly inventoried and appraised before anyone outside this office knows they exist. Do you have any idea how much they are worth?" The owner of the shop told me yesterday that his estimate is around $2.5 million. Catherine did not react. She wrote a number down on her legal pad. "Then we have a great deal of work to do, very quickly, and we need to do it before your husband's family files anything in probate court. Have they contacted you through their attorney?" "He left a message last night." "Did you call him back?" "No." "Good. Do not. Mrs. Whitfield, are you willing to retain me as your counsel?" "Yes." "Then, as of this moment, you have legal representation. Do not speak to anyone in your husband's family without me present. Do not sign anything. Do not agree to any visits or meetings until I have advised you. If anyone shows up at your door, you may tell them politely that you are not available, and you may close the door. If they persist, you call me, and I will handle it. Is that clear?" "Yes." "One more thing. The appraisal on Thursday. I want to be there." Helen considered this for a moment. Then she nodded. "All right." "And the owner of the pawn shop, Mr. Marlow. I will need to speak with him in advance. Can you arrange that?" "I think so." "Good. We will go together this afternoon." They went that afternoon. Catherine drove. Helen sat in the passenger seat and watched the city slide past the window and tried to feel as if any of this were actually happening to her. Albert Marlow met them at the door of the shop with the same quiet courtesy he had shown Helen the first day. He shook Catherine's hand. He locked the door behind them and turned the sign. He brought out a third chair from the back room and arranged it at the counter, and the 3 of them sat down together, and Catherine took out a yellow legal pad and a pen and began to ask Albert questions in the same measured, unhurried way she had asked Helen questions that morning. Albert answered every one of them. He produced ledgers. He produced receipts. He produced a stack of authentication certificates from the appraisal services Frank had used over the years. He explained the chain of custody. He explained the rental agreement on the drawer, which had been renewed annually in writing and which Frank had signed each time. He explained that his shop kept records of every transaction going back to 1989, when his father had finally agreed to modernize the bookkeeping, and that everything Frank had purchased through his shop or stored in his drawer was documented in those records and could be produced for inspection at any time. Catherine wrote it all down. When she was finished, she looked at Albert with what was almost a smile. "Mr. Marlow, I do not often say this to people, but you appear to have run your business in a way that is going to make my job substantially easier than I expected." "Frank insisted on it," Albert said. "He told me from the beginning that everything had to be on paper. He said his wife would need to be able to prove every dollar." He was right. He usually was. Catherine closed her legal pad. She looked at Helen. "The appraisal on Thursday is going to be the inflection point. Once the official valuation is on paper, everything changes. The family will hear about it within a week regardless of what we do, because appraisers talk, and because the figures are going to be large enough to attract attention. We need to be ready for what happens after." "How do you suggest we proceed?" Albert asked. "I suggest that on Thursday afternoon we do the appraisal, get the figure on paper, and immediately move the collection to a bonded vault in a financial institution chosen by Mrs. Whitfield. Not yours, Mr. Marlow, with respect. Your shop has been more than secure for 30 years, but the moment the figure is known, your shop becomes a target, and I will not have my client's inheritance sitting in a building on Adams Street one day longer than necessary. I have a relationship with a private vault in the financial district. The transfer can be arranged for Thursday evening. That is sensible. I will arrange security for the transport. We will have the items insured before they leave your premises. And then, Mrs. Whitfield, we will begin the much longer and slower process of figuring out what you actually want to do with the rest of your life. Helen had not thought about it in those words before. The rest of your life. She heard the phrase, and she felt something move inside her chest, the first faint stirring of a future that did not look like the past. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. They left the pawn shop at 4. Catherine drove Helen home. They sat in the car in the driveway for a long minute. Catherine looked at the house, and at the bare yard, and at the dead tomato plants visible at the edge of the side fence. Mrs. Whitfield, yes, you have spent a long time being underestimated. I want you to understand that you are about to spend an even longer time being noticed. The people who have looked through you for years are going to look very hard at you for a while. Some of them are going to want things from you. Some of them are going to want to take things from you. You are going to need to make some decisions about who you trust and how far. I will help you with the legal part. But the rest of it, the part about who you let into your life and who you keep out, that is going to be yours to figure out. Do you understand? I understand. Get some sleep. I will see you Thursday at 1. Catherine drove away. Helen stood in the driveway in the cold and watched the car turn the corner. The street was empty. The light was beginning to fail. She thought she heard a dog barking far away, but it stopped before she could be sure. She let herself into the house. The phone was ringing. She answered it on the third ring without thinking, and Robert's voice came through the line. Helen, finally. Robert, you haven't returned any of our calls. I've been busy. Helen, Linda told me about your behavior yesterday afternoon. We are very worried about you. Mr. Hahn has been trying to reach you. I would appreciate it if you would treat his attempts with the seriousness they deserve. Helen kept her voice as flat as she could. Robert, I have an attorney. Her name is Catherine Donnelly. Any further communication from your attorney should be directed to her. There was a silence on the other end of the line. A long one. Helen could hear Robert breathing. You have an attorney. I do. Helen, that is not necessary. There is no dispute here. We are family. Then there will be no problem with your attorney speaking to mine. What is going on, Helen? What are you not telling us? She closed her eyes. She felt very tired and very calm. Robert, Frank left a will. I am the sole beneficiary. There is nothing about my husband's estate that involves you or Linda or anyone else in your family. If you have questions, Ms. Donnelly's number is in the directory. Please do not call this house again. She hung up. She stood with her hand on the receiver for a long time. Then she unplugged the phone from the wall and put it on the kitchen counter, and she went upstairs and ran a bath and got into it with the water as hot as she could stand, and she lay there until her fingers wrinkled and the water cooled, and she thought about nothing at all. Wednesday she stayed in the house. She did not answer the door. At 11 in the morning, a car pulled into the driveway, and Linda got out and rang the bell 3 times. Helen watched from the upstairs window. Linda waited 4 minutes on the porch. She walked around the side of the house and looked into the kitchen window. She came back to the front door and rang the bell again. She wrote something on a piece of paper and slid it through the mail slot. Then she got back in her car and drove away. Helen waited until the car was gone before she came downstairs. She picked up the paper from where it had landed on the entryway floor. It was a note in Linda's careful handwriting. Helen, we need to talk. This is not how family handles things. We are coming to the house tomorrow at noon. Please be here. Linda. Helen read the note twice. Then she folded it in half. Then she opened the kitchen drawer where Frank had kept the matches for the gas stove, and she struck one, and she held the corner of the note in the flame over the sink until it caught, and she watched it burn down to her fingers before she dropped the last black corner into the basin and ran the water over it. She had never burned anything in her life. She found, to her own surprise, that it felt good. She spent the rest of the day in the bedroom, reading more of the letters from the wooden box. She went slowly. She made herself stop every few letters to look out the window or to make a cup of tea. She did not want to consume them all at once. She wanted them to last. She read about the year Frank had taken her to the Grand Canyon for their 10th anniversary, a trip he had saved for in secret for 18 months because he had known she had always wanted to see it. She read about the year their dog Murphy had died and Frank had buried him under the dogwood tree in the backyard and had cried for 3 days when he thought Helen was not looking. She read about the year Helen herself had been sick, a bad sickness, the one that had landed her in the hospital for 11 days the autumn she was 43, and Frank had written that he had spent every one of those nights sitting in the chair by her bed and watching her chest rise and fall and praying for the first time in his adult life and making promises to a God he had not believed in since childhood. If she lived, he had written, he would spend the rest of his life trying to deserve her. She had lived, and he had spent the rest of his life trying to deserve her in the way he had known best, which was the quiet, patient accumulation of small objects of value, set aside, year after year, against the day she would need them. She had not known. She had not known any of it. She had been married to him for 31 years, and she had known almost nothing. She thought, as the afternoon faded, that the worst part of it was not finding out now. The worst part was that he had never given her the chance to thank him while he was alive. She slept that night for 9 hours. She did not dream. When she woke up Thursday morning, she felt clear, the way a person feels clear after a long fever has broken. She showered. She put on a navy blue dress she had not worn since her cousin's wedding 2 years before, and she put on the pearl earrings, and she did her hair carefully. She made herself a real breakfast and ate all of it. She washed the dishes. She walked through the house slowly, room by room, as if seeing it for the last time before something changed, which in a sense she was. At 12:45 she got in the truck and drove to Adams Street. Catherine's car was already there. 2 other cars were parked at the curb, both unfamiliar to Helen. Inside the shop, Albert had cleared a long folding table into the center of the floor. 2 men stood beside it. One was perhaps 50, in a gray suit, with a small magnifying loop on a cord around his neck and a leather case open beside him containing a battery of jeweler's instruments. The other was a younger man with a clipboard who introduced himself as the appraiser's associate. Catherine stood to one side, holding her legal pad. Albert stood behind the counter with his hands folded. The appraiser was Dr. Edward Pell. He shook Helen's hand. His grip was dry and firm. He said, "Mrs. Whitfield, your husband was a remarkable man. I had the privilege of corresponding with him several times over the years on matters of authentication. I am very sorry for your loss." Helen had not expected this. She did not know what to say. She nodded, and she said, "Thank you." And she found that she was grateful in a way that surprised her, because none of the people who had attended Frank's funeral had been able to say anything as specific or as true. Dr. Pell turned to the table. He looked at Albert. "Shall we begin?" Albert went into the back. He returned a few minutes later carrying the drawer itself, the entire drawer, lifted out of its slot in the vault, the envelopes inside it neatly stacked. He set it down on the table. He stepped back. Dr. Pell pulled on a pair of thin white cotton gloves and lifted out the first envelope. For the next 4 hours, Helen sat on a chair at the side of the room and watched a man she did not know examine the secret labor of her husband's life. Dr. Pell worked slowly. He removed each coin from its envelope. He set it on a black velvet pad. He examined it through his loupe. He turned it carefully with the tip of a small tool. He examined the certification slabs, the authentication stickers, the receipts from the original purchase. He spoke quietly into a small recorder as he worked, dictating his findings: the year, the mint mark, the grade, the current market estimate. His associate wrote everything down on the clipboard. When he was done with a coin, he replaced it carefully in its sleeve, replaced the sleeve in its envelope, and moved to the next. Helen watched all of it. She did not look away. She wanted to remember. She wanted to be able to say, later, that she had seen each one, that she had witnessed it. Catherine stood near the door for most of the 4 hours. She did not interrupt. She did not ask questions. She watched the appraisal with the focused attention of a person who was making sure no detail escaped her notice. Albert sat on his stool behind the counter. He did not read his book. He watched too. At a little after 5, Dr. Pell placed the last coin back in its envelope. He removed his gloves. He clicked off his recorder. He stood for a moment with his hands resting flat on the table, and then he turned to Helen, and he said, "Mrs. Whitfield, are you prepared for the figure?" Helen looked at Catherine. Catherine nodded. "Yes." Dr. Pell consulted his clipboard. He turned a page. He set the clipboard down on the table. The total appraised value of the collection, based on current market conditions and confirmed grading on all items, is $4,187,000. Helen heard the figure. The room did not tilt. She had been ready for it, in the way that a person can be ready for something they have known was coming but have not been able to imagine. $2.5 million was the number Frank had given Albert 4 years ago. The market had appreciated. She had been told to expect more. $4 million was more. But the figure also seemed to come from very far away. She heard it the way a person hears their own name called in a crowded station, recognizing it without yet being able to turn toward the voice that called it. Catherine said quietly, "Thank you, Dr. Pell." "There is one more item," Dr. Pell said. "It was not in the drawer. Mr. Marlow asked me to look at it separately before we conclude." He turned to Albert. Albert nodded, and he went into the back of the shop, and he returned carrying a small wooden box about the size of a deck of cards. He set it on the table next to the empty drawer. He did not open it. He looked at Helen. "Mrs. Whitfield, your husband left this in my keeping 14 months ago. He told me it was not part of the collection in the drawer. He told me it was a separate thing, a personal thing, and that I was to give it to you when you came. Only to you. Not to your attorney, not to the appraiser." He was very clear on this point. Helen looked at the box. It was unremarkable. Plain dark wood, no carving on the lid, no latch. It would have fit easily into a coat pocket. "What's in it?" "He told me that as well. He said you would understand the moment you opened it. He said it was the most important thing in the drawer, even though it was not in the drawer at all. He asked me to tell you those words exactly. The most important thing in the drawer, even though it is not in the drawer at all." Helen stood up. Her legs felt strange under her. She crossed the room to the table. The box was very light when she lifted it. She held it in both hands. She looked at Catherine, who said nothing. She looked at Dr. Pell, who had taken a respectful step back. She looked at Albert, who looked at her with the calm patience of a man who had been waiting for this moment to arrive for over a year. She opened the box. Inside, resting on a small piece of folded blue cloth, was a diamond ring. The setting was simple, a platinum band with 4 small prongs holding a single round stone. The stone was not the largest diamond Helen had ever seen, but it was the most beautiful because it was the first one that had ever been hers. Beneath the cloth, folded into a square so small it had almost disappeared into the bottom of the box, was a piece of paper. Helen lifted it out. She unfolded it. It was the last note Frank had written her, and it was dated 3 weeks before he died. "Helen, if you are reading this, then I have run out of time, and Albert has done what I asked him to do, and you have come this far on your own. I am sorry I could not put this ring on your finger myself. I bought it last year. I have been carrying it in my pocket every Friday for 14 months, trying to find the right moment, and the right moment never came, because there was never a moment that seemed big enough for what I wanted to say. So I am writing it down instead. I owed you a ring. I have owed you a ring for 30 years. I am sorry it took me so long. I am sorry I could not afford to buy it sooner. I am sorry I could not give it to you myself. Wear it if you want to. Don't wear it if you don't. Either way, it is yours, the way everything I have built was always yours. You were the reason for all of it. You were the reason for everything. I love you, Helen. I will love you when this letter is the only part of me left. I will love you after that too. Frank." Helen stood in the middle of the shop with the ring in one hand and the letter in the other, and she did not cry, because she had cried so much in the last week that she did not believe she had any tears left. She stood very still. She looked at the ring. She looked at the letter. She thought of Frank carrying that small box in his coveralls pocket every Friday for 14 months, walking past Albert's counter on his way to the back of the shop, pausing perhaps to think about whether today was the day, deciding always that it was not, taking it home again, putting it back in its hiding place, getting up the next morning to go to work. She slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit. He had known her ring size. Of course he had. He had been married to her for 31 years. She closed the box. She picked up the letter and folded it back into its small square and put it in the pocket of her dress. She turned to the 3 people watching her, and she said, in a voice that was steadier than she would have believed possible, "I am ready to go home." They moved the collection that night. Catherine had arranged everything. 2 men in dark coats arrived in an armored van at 6:30. They loaded the drawer, the envelopes, and the wooden box with the ring inside it into a steel case. They drove to a private vault in the financial district. Helen rode in Catherine's car behind the van. Albert closed his shop for the night and went home. The transfer was completed at 8:45. Helen signed the deposit paperwork. The vault clerk handed her a key and a small slip of paper with a private access code. Catherine drove her home. Helen got out of the car in her driveway. The house was dark. The street was quiet. She thanked Catherine, and she walked to her front door, and she let herself in. She did not turn on the light. She stood in the entryway and felt the ring on her finger and the letter in her pocket, and she felt, for the first time in 11 days, that the worst part of this was now behind her. She was wrong. The phone rang at 9 the next morning. It was Catherine, and her voice was sharper than Helen had heard it before. Mrs. Whitfield, Robert and Linda Whitfield filed a petition this morning in probate court. They are contesting the will. Helen sat down at the kitchen table. On what grounds? They are alleging that your husband was not of sound mind when the will was executed. They are also alleging that you exerted undue influence over him during the years prior to his death. And they are alleging the existence of substantial undisclosed marital assets that they claim should have been part of family discussion under what they describe as a long-standing family agreement. There is no family agreement. I know there is no family agreement. They know there is no family agreement. The petition is not designed to win. It is designed to delay, to create publicity, and to give them leverage to negotiate a settlement. They have heard about the appraisal. How did they hear so fast? There was a pause on the line. That is what I would like to know, Mrs. Whitfield. And that is what we are going to find out. Catherine arrived at the house at 10. She came in carrying a thick folder and a second cup of coffee, which she set down on the kitchen table without ceremony. Helen had made coffee already. They sat across from each other in the same chairs she and Frank had sat in for 31 years, and Catherine opened the folder, and they began. There are 4 people who could have leaked the appraisal, Catherine said. Dr. Pell, his associate, Mr. Marlow, the transport company, plus me and you. We can rule out the last 2. We can rule out Mr. Marlow because he has kept your husband's secret for 30 years and because the leak does not benefit him in any way. The associate is unlikely because he is young, salaried, and his career in this field depends entirely on confidentiality. The transport company received only a sealed case and was given no information about its contents. That leaves Dr. Pell, which I do not believe, or someone we are not considering, such as someone who was watching the shop, or someone who was watching this house, or someone who has been listening to your conversations. Helen looked at her. Listening how? That is a very good question. Mrs. Whitfield, when did you tell anyone outside this conversation about the value of the coins? Only Mr. Marlow gave me a figure. That was a week ago. I did not repeat the figure to anyone. Did you tell anyone you had been to the pawn shop? No. Did anyone see you go to the pawn shop? Helen stopped. She thought about it. She thought about the morning she had driven down to Adams Street the second time. She thought about Linda's car sitting in front of her mailbox when she got home. Linda had asked her where she had been. Linda had been waiting. Linda came to the house Monday afternoon. She was already there when I got back from the shop. She asked me where I had been. Catherine's expression did not change, but her pen paused on the page. How long had she been waiting? I don't know. She was sitting in her car. She had a clear view of the driveway. Did she see you arrive? Yes. In Frank's truck? Yes. Did she know that you had been driving Frank's truck? I don't think so. I had not told her. Catherine wrote something down. She underlined it twice. Mrs. Whitfield, I want you to think about this carefully. In the days between Frank's death and Monday afternoon, did anything in your house look as if it had been moved or examined? Helen sat very still. She thought about the Tuesday morning after Frank had died, when she had come downstairs and felt, for the briefest moment, that something in the kitchen had been disturbed. The salt shaker had been on the wrong side of the table. She had assumed she had moved it herself the night before and forgotten. She thought about the way the front door had been unlocked once when she returned from the grocery store, even though she had been sure she locked it. She thought about Linda's offer to come down and help with the garage. Linda has a key to the house. Frank gave it to her years ago, in case of emergency. Robert may have one as well. Did you change the locks after Frank died? No, I didn't think to. Then we are going to change them today? Mrs. Whitfield, I do not want to frighten you. But I want you to understand that the people pursuing this petition have had access to your home for at least the week since your husband died, and possibly for years before that. Anything they found, they have. Anything they suspected, they have had time to confirm. I am operating on the assumption that they have known about the existence of the pawnshop arrangement, in some form, for longer than you have. The petition was not filed in response to the appraisal. The petition was prepared in advance. The appraisal was simply the trigger that authorized them to file. Helen put her hands flat on the table. The ring on her finger caught the light. How would they have known? Frank never told anyone but Albert. There are a few possibilities. Mail could have been intercepted at some point over the years. Receipts could have been seen. Frank could have, at some moment of vulnerability, said something to a family member that he later forgot or downplayed. But the most likely possibility is much simpler. Robert is an accountant. Robert has had 30 years to look at his brother's tax filings. If Frank ever reported coin purchases as collectibles for capital gains purposes, even once, even in passing, Robert could have noticed. Frank wouldn't have done that. He wouldn't have known he was doing it. He would have followed the advice of whoever prepared his return. If a paid preparer ever noticed irregularities and asked questions, those questions might have gone unanswered or might have been answered in ways that left a paper trail. We will find out. I have already requested the relevant records under our authorization. They will be in my office by tomorrow. Helen sat back. She felt suddenly very tired. Catherine, I do not want to fight my husband's family in court. I know. I am not afraid of them. I am not even angry at them, not really. I am only tired. I have been tired for a week. I would like for this to be over. It will be over. But it will not be over today, and the way to make it be over sooner rather than later is to make it very expensive for them to continue. Which is what we are going to do. Beginning this afternoon. The locksmith came at noon. He changed every lock in the house. He installed a deadbolt on the back door that had not been there before. He also installed, at Catherine's suggestion, a small camera at the front porch that recorded to a memory card hidden inside the house. Helen watched all of it with a feeling of dull surprise. She had lived in this house for 22 years without ever thinking it needed to be secured against the people who supposedly loved her. At 1:30, Catherine left. She had appointments at her office. She would call in the evening. She told Helen to stay inside, to answer the phone only if the caller. Identification showed Catherine's number or Albert's, or a number Helen had been told to expect. She told Helen that if anyone came to the door, Helen was to stay upstairs and let them go away. She told Helen that the worst was probably not over, but that the worst had a shape now, and a shape was something that could be managed. After Catherine left, Helen went upstairs to the bedroom. She took the wooden box of letters off the dresser. She brought it down to the kitchen and set it on the table. She had been reading the letters slowly, in order, the way she would have read a long novel. She decided that she did not have the patience for that anymore. She wanted to know if Frank had ever written anything about his family, about Robert, about Linda, about what he had thought might happen when he was gone. She untied the letter for 2018. She read it. He had written about how the kitchen ceiling had needed paint that year and how he had not been able to find the right shade and had finally given up and used the closest one and Helen had not noticed for 3 months. She put it down. She untied the letter for 2019. He had written about her birthday and about a recipe for chicken she had made that he wanted her to know he loved. She put it down. She untied 2020. He had written about the year of the pandemic and about how grateful he had been that they had each other and that he had not been alone in the silence. She untied 2021. This letter was longer than the others. It was 3 pages on both sides. The handwriting was tighter, as if he had been trying to fit more than usual onto the paper. Helen, there is something I want to write down this year. I have been putting it off for too long. It has to do with my brother. I love Robert. I have loved him my whole life. He is older than me, and he was always smarter than me at the things our father considered smart, which was numbers and figures and the kind of patience that lets a man sit at a desk and never get tired of it. I was not that kind of man. I never could be. My father never forgave me for it, and my mother defended me to him until the day she died, and Robert, in the way of older brothers, took our father's side because that was easier than the alternative. I have not blamed him for that. I have not held it against him. But I have watched him carefully over the years. I have watched him with you. I have watched him with Linda. I have watched the way he calculates what other people are worth and the way he stores those calculations, and the way he holds on to them. He is not a bad man. But he believes, in a way I cannot make him stop believing, that the world is a ledger, and that everything in it must balance, and that the things he has earned and the things he has inherited and the things he can claim by right of family are all entries on the same page. He has not made an entry for the coins. I have been careful, but I have also been a mechanic for 40 years, and a mechanic notices when his brother starts asking him casual questions at Thanksgiving about how the shop is doing, about whether there is enough work, about how I manage to live on what I make. Robert has been wondering for a long time how we are still in this house. He has been wondering how the truck is still running. He has been wondering how I take you out for dinner once a month even now, and how I bought you the pearl earrings for our 25th, and how I paid cash for the new roof in 2017. He has been wondering. He has not yet decided that there is anything to wonder about. But if I am gone before you find this, he will start asking the questions out loud, and he will not stop. He will tell himself that he is asking out of concern. He will tell himself he is protecting you. He will not understand that what he is really doing is making an entry in his ledger and trying to balance it. I am not going to tell you what to do about him. You will know what to do. You have known how to handle Robert for 30 years. You have done it by being polite and by being kind and by never giving him anything to use against you. And you have done it better than I ever could. But Helen, if it comes to a fight, do not be polite. Do not be kind. Politeness and kindness are what he is counting on. He believes you are too small to fight him. He believes you are too uneducated, too quiet, too gentle. He is wrong about all three. He is wrong about you in every way it is possible for a man to be wrong about a woman. I have left you the means to fight him. I have left you a lawyer's name and number in the small notebook in my top desk drawer, the woman who handled some quiet business for me 3 years ago. I have left you a list of names of people who have helped me at various times, men and women who knew me well enough to know that if anyone is using my name to take something from you, that thing was never theirs to take. And I have left you the truth. The truth is the most valuable thing I have left you, and it does not have a price the way the coins do, and Robert cannot count it. The truth is that I have loved you. The truth is that I have spent every day of our marriage trying to be worthy of you. The truth is that everything I built because of you, and that no one in the world has any claim on any of it except you. Hold on to that. Hold on to it the way you would hold on to a tool that you needed for a job. It is the thing that will get you through what is coming. I love you. F. Helen read the letter twice. She read it a third time. Then she folded it carefully and set it aside on the table, not back in the box with the others. She got up. She walked into the small study at the front of the house, the room that had been Frank's, with his old metal desk and his calendar from 2024 still hanging on the wall and his coffee cup with the broken handle sitting on a stack of papers. She opened the top desk drawer. Inside, beneath a pad of yellow paper exactly like the one Frank had used for the note he left under the salt shaker, was a small spiral notebook. She lifted it out. Inside the front cover, in Frank's handwriting, was a name and a phone number. Margaret Sullivan, attorney at law. Below it was a list of names. 8 of them, each name followed by a phone number and a single phrase describing what the person did for a living or how Frank had known them. A coin dealer in Cleveland, an appraiser in Pittsburgh, a retired bank manager who had helped Frank set up the safety deposit box where he kept the original receipts, a locksmith, a man who Frank had described only as trust him, he was Navy with me, a private investigator in Cincinnati, a second attorney who specialized in estate disputes. The last name on the list was Albert Marlow. Helen carried the notebook back into the kitchen. She sat down at the table. She picked up the phone. She dialed Catherine. Catherine, it's Helen Whitfield. I have something I think you should see. What is it? Frank left a notebook. He left names. He left a different lawyer. A woman named Margaret Sullivan. The line was quiet for a second. Mrs. Whitfield. Margaret Sullivan was a partner at one of the most aggressive litigation firms in this state for 20 years before she went into private practice. She is also the woman I would have referred you to myself if I had not been able to take your case. Your husband knew exactly who he was sending you to. He knew Robert was going to do this. He knew. Helen looked down at the notebook in her hand. She thought of Frank, sitting at his old metal desk, writing out the names in his careful slanted handwriting, making sure each one had a phone number, making sure each one had a brief description she would understand. She thought of him doing it not in fear or anger, but in the same patient way he had once changed the timing belt on her car, taking each step in order, leaving nothing to chance, making sure that when the moment came, the machine would run. What do you want me to do? Bring the notebook to my office tomorrow morning. 9 o'clock. I am going to call Margaret tonight. Mrs. Whitfield, I want to tell you something. Your husband was 3 steps ahead of his brother before his brother ever started running. We are not behind in this fight. We have not been behind for a long time. We are simply standing in a place that has been prepared for us. Do you understand? I think I am beginning to. Get some sleep. I will see you tomorrow. Helen hung up the phone. She sat at the kitchen table in the late afternoon light. The dead tomato plants stood in the yard outside the window. The wooden box of letters sat closed in front of her. The diamond ring caught the sun on her finger. The yellow note that had started all of this lay where she had left it 11 days before, under the salt shaker, as if waiting to see what happened next. She was not afraid. She thought about Robert. She thought about Linda. She thought about the lawyer Gregory Hahn and his smooth professional voice on the answering machine. She thought about the petition they had filed in probate court and the figure of $4,187,000 that they had somehow learned and the way they had been moving against her, quietly, for longer than she had known. She thought about Frank. She thought about 31 years of Friday afternoons. She thought about the workbench in the garage and the key taped to its leg. She thought about a man who had loved her enough to spend half his life preparing her for the moment he would not be there to protect her. She would not be polite. She would not be kind. Frank had told her not to be, and Frank had earned the right to be listened to. The phone rang. Helen did not move at first. She let it ring twice. Then she picked it up. A voice she did not recognize spoke on the other end. A woman's voice. Calm. Steady. With a faint trace of an accent Helen could not place. Mrs. Whitfield, my name is Margaret Sullivan. Your husband asked me, 3 years ago, to call you on the day this call needed to be made. Catherine Donnelly has just spoken to me. We have a great deal to discuss. I am driving to your house now. I will be there in 40 minutes. Please put on a pot of coffee, and please do not answer the door for anyone else until I arrive. Is that all right with you? Helen looked out the window. The light was beginning to fail. Somewhere down the street, a car turned the corner and slowed as it passed her house. Helen watched it go past. She did not recognize the car. She turned away from the window. Yes, Mrs. Sullivan. That is all right with me. I will put on the coffee. She hung up the phone. She stood for a moment in the kitchen. Then she walked to the cabinet, took down the coffee tin, and began to measure the grounds into the basket. The fight was beginning. She was ready for it. Margaret Sullivan arrived at 6 minutes past 8. Helen had been watching the street from the kitchen window for half an hour by then, and she saw the car pull up to the curb and stop, and she saw the woman who got out of it, and she understood within a few seconds that her husband had not chosen lightly. Margaret was perhaps 62. She was tall. She wore a long gray coat, no scarf, no jewelry, and she carried a leather briefcase the way a carpenter carries a hammer. She walked up the path to the door without hurrying and without lingering, and when Helen opened the door before she had time to knock, Margaret looked at her for a long moment, took in the navy dress and the pearl earrings and the diamond ring on her finger, and said, Mrs. Whitfield, Frank told me you would meet me at the door. He said you were never one for waiting. He was wrong about a lot of things, Helen said. He was right about almost all of them. Margaret smiled. The smile lasted exactly long enough to register and not a second longer. She stepped past Helen into the front hall and put her briefcase on the small table by the stairs and shrugged out of her coat. Coffee, please. They sat at the kitchen table. Helen poured. Margaret did not begin by introducing herself or by offering condolences or by asking how Helen was feeling. She opened her briefcase and removed a single manila folder and set it on the table between them, and she folded her hands on top of it, and she said, Mrs. Whitfield, I am going to tell you everything I know about your husband's preparations, and then I am going to tell you what I think we should do about your brother-in-law. I am going to be efficient because I think you have been through enough conversations that were not efficient. Is that all right with you? Yes. 3 years ago, your husband retained me to handle a matter that I will describe in a moment. He paid my fee in cash. He requested complete confidentiality, which I have honored until tonight. The matter he retained me for was the documentation, in advance, of every legal step that would be necessary to defend his estate against a contestation by his brother. He believed his brother would contest. He told me why he believed it. He gave me copies of certain financial records, and he gave me a written statement, witnessed and notarized, attesting to his mental competence on the date of its execution. He gave me names and contact information for the people who had assisted him over the years in the acquisition and storage of certain assets. He gave me a chronology. He gave me a strategy. The folder in front of me contains all of it. Helen looked at the folder. It was perhaps an inch thick. He gave you a strategy for a fight that had not started yet. He gave me a strategy for a fight he was certain was coming. He was a thoughtful man, Mrs. Whitfield. He was, in some ways, the most thoughtful client I have ever had. How did he know it would be Robert? Margaret opened the folder. She turned several pages until she came to a section she was looking for, and she pulled out a single sheet of paper and turned it so Helen could see it. It was a copy of an invoice. The letterhead read Birkland and Associates Investigations, Cincinnati, Ohio. The date was 6 years previous. The client name was Robert Whitfield. The description of services rendered was a single line. Surveillance and pattern documentation, F. Whitfield, 12 weeks. Helen stared at it. Robert had Frank followed. For 3 months, 6 years ago. The investigator's report is also in this folder. Your husband obtained both documents through entirely legal means, which I am happy to explain to you another day if you are curious. The point for this evening is that Frank knew his brother had been watching him. He knew Robert had identified the pattern of Friday visits. He knew Robert had identified the pawnshop. He knew Robert had not been able to establish what was inside the drawer because the drawer was inside a vault that he could not access. But he also knew that Robert had been waiting, patiently, for the day Frank would die so that the contents could be brought into probate. Your husband prepared for that day for 6 years, Mrs. Whitfield. I have been part of that preparation for the last 3 of them. You are not at the beginning of this fight. You are walking into the final third of it, and most of the work has already been done. Helen sat with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup. She did not feel angry. She had expected to feel angry, hearing this. Instead, she felt something quieter and steadier, a kind of cold clarity that she recognized as the feeling Frank had always had when he was working on something that required precision. What is the strategy? Margaret turned another page in her folder. We file 3 things tomorrow. We file our response to their petition, denying every allegation and demanding documentation and support. We file a motion to dismiss for lack of standing, because Robert is not a beneficiary under any version of the will and has no legal interest in the estate. And we file a separate complaint against Robert personally for tortious interference and for violation of the privacy statute, based on the surveillance he conducted on your husband 6 years ago, which we will document with the invoice you are looking at. The complaint against Robert will not be filed publicly at first. It will be served on him through his attorney, and his attorney will be given 72 hours to advise his client to withdraw the probate petition. If the petition is withdrawn, we do not file the complaint. If the petition is not withdrawn, we file the complaint, and the complaint becomes a matter of public record, and Robert Whitfield, certified public accountant, partner in a respected firm in Cincinnati, suddenly finds himself defending a private investigation of his own brother in the local press. Helen looked at her. You are going to blackmail him. I am going to leverage him, Mrs. Whitfield. There is a difference, but only a small one, and I am not going to pretend to you that it is large. The choice is his. He can withdraw the petition and the matter ends. He can refuse, and we go to war. Your husband's instructions, written and witnessed, were to give him the choice. I am going to follow those instructions. Are you comfortable with that approach? Helen thought about it. She thought about Frank, sitting in Margaret's office 3 years ago, going over each step. She thought about him paying her fee in cash. She thought about the patience it must have taken to gather 6 years of evidence against his own brother and to put that evidence in a folder and to leave that folder with a stranger and to never mention any of it to his wife, because mentioning it would have meant burdening her with knowledge he had hoped she would never need. Yes, she said. I am comfortable with that approach. Good. Then I will draft the filings tonight. I will need you in my office at 9 in the morning to sign them. Catherine has been informed and will be present. We will deliver the complaint to Mr. Hahn's office by courier before noon. What about the appraisal leak? Margaret looked at her over the rim of her coffee cup. There was no leak. Robert knew. Robert knew there was something to know. He has known for 6 years. He has not known the figure. The figure is still ours. The petition was filed on the assumption that the figure existed. Robert did not need to know the actual number to file. He only needed to know that there was a number. He has been preparing his own filing for years, in the same way that we have been preparing ours. The only thing that triggered him was your husband's death. Helen felt something shift inside her. She had spent the morning convinced that someone she trusted had betrayed her. She realized now that no one had. The figure was still secret. The figure would remain secret, unless and until Helen herself chose to reveal it, in court or otherwise. She felt a small, unexpected wave of relief. What about Linda? What about her? She has a key. She has been in the house. Catherine thinks she may have searched it. Almost certainly. Robert is too careful to do that himself. Linda is not. She has been Robert's eyes inside this house for a long time. I would assume that anything she found in writing has been photographed. I would also assume that she did not find the most important things, because the most important things were not in writing where she could find them, and because Frank was a very careful man. What do I do about her? You do nothing about her, Mrs. Whitfield. You let the petition proceed or be withdrawn. You let her husband decide what to do. If he withdraws, Linda's role in this becomes irrelevant. If he does not withdraw, the surveillance question consumes the matter and Linda's small efforts become a footnote. Either way, she is not the problem. She has never been the problem. Robert has always been the problem. We are going to address the problem. Margaret closed the folder. She set down her cup. She looked at Helen for a long moment, and her face softened in a way Helen had not seen it do until then. Mrs. Whitfield, I want to tell you something else, and I want you to hear it from me rather than from a piece of paper. Your husband loved you in a way that I have not often encountered in this profession. I have sat across desks from a great many men who claimed to be planning for their wives' futures. Most of them were planning for their own legacies. They wanted their names on buildings. They wanted to be remembered. Your husband did not want any of that. He wanted you taken care of. He did not want his name on anything. He told me, in the only personal conversation we ever had, that the only thing he wanted out of all of this was for you to be able to live the rest of your life without ever having to count the money in your purse before you went into a store. That is what he asked me to help him build for you. That is what we are going to finish building. I want you to know that. I want you to remember it when the next few weeks get hard. Helen could not answer her. She nodded. She picked up Margaret's cup and her own and carried them to the sink and washed them slowly with her back to the table, because she did not want Margaret to see her face just then. When she turned around, Margaret was standing, putting on her coat, picking up her briefcase. She did not comment on what had just happened. She gave Helen the address of her office and a card with her direct line, and she told Helen to lock the door after her, and she left. Helen stood in the front hall with her hand on the door. She listened to Margaret's car start and pull away. Then she walked through the house and locked every door and every window and turned off every light except the one in the kitchen, and she sat down at the table again, alone, with the wooden box of letters and the diamond ring and the small notebook of names and the silence Frank had left her. She slept that night without dreaming. In the morning she did exactly what Margaret had told her to do. She signed the filings at 9. The courier delivered the complaint at 11:37. By 2 in the afternoon, Margaret had received a phone call from Gregory Hahn requesting an immediate conference. By 4, Robert had been informed by his attorney of the contents of the complaint, including the surveillance invoice and the investigator's report. By 6, the probate petition was withdrawn. It happened that fast. Helen sat in Margaret's office that evening drinking a glass of water and listening to Margaret describe the conversations she had had over the course of the afternoon, and she understood that what Frank had built for her was not only a fortune in coins. He had built a wall. The wall had stood empty and waiting for 6 years. The day his brother had thrown a rock at it, the wall had not even moved. There was a small additional matter. Margaret negotiated it carefully. Robert wanted assurances that the surveillance complaint would not be filed under any circumstances, regardless of his future behavior. Margaret offered those assurances in exchange for a written statement, signed and notarized, in which Robert formally renounced any claim of any kind against Helen, the estate, the coins, or anything else connected to his brother's life or property. The statement was drafted by Margaret. It was specific. It used the word renounce 4 separate times. Robert signed it on a Friday morning in Margaret's office without ever speaking to Helen directly, and after he had signed it, Margaret slid a copy across the table to Hahn and told him that the matter was concluded. Linda called Helen once after that, 2 weeks later. The voice on the answering machine was different from the one Helen had been listening to for 31 years. It was quieter, less sure of itself. Linda said she hoped that someday they could speak again as family. She said she was sorry for any misunderstandings. She did not mention Robert. She did not mention the petition. Helen listened to the message twice. Then she pressed delete. She did not call back. The winter passed. Helen did not know how to describe the way the winter passed. Margaret guided her through the establishment of 2 accounts at the bank, a checking account and a long-term account that was managed by a firm Margaret recommended. The coins remained in the private vault, while a slow, careful plan was developed for their gradual sale. The proceeds reinvested in arrangements that would generate enough income to keep Helen comfortable for the rest of her life and beyond. The first sale was a single coin, the 1893 Carson City Morgan dollar that Frank had paid $9,000 for in 1999. It sold at auction in February for $61,000. Helen used a small portion of the proceeds to pay off the mortgage on the house, which she had not realized still had a balance on it, and she used another portion to fix the upstairs bathroom that Frank had been promising to fix for 22 years, and she put the rest in the long-term account and did not think about it again. She did the things she had been promising herself she would do for a long time. She got her hair cut by a real stylist for the first time in 11 years. She bought herself 2 pairs of shoes that fit. She drove the Buick to a mechanic Frank had once recommended and had it repaired properly instead of patched, and the mechanic, when he learned whose widow she was, would not let her pay him. He said Frank had pulled him out of a hole 20 years ago and had refused payment then, and he was not going to take her money now. Helen told him she would not argue with him about it, but that she would bring him pies for the rest of his life, and the mechanic, who was a hard man not given to sentiment, laughed and said that would be acceptable. She started bringing pies to other people too. The woman who had been her supervisor at the diner where she had waitressed 20 years before, who was now retired and lived alone in a small apartment on the north side of town. The neighbor across the street who had shoveled her driveway twice in the week after Frank died and had refused to let her thank him. Albert Marlow. She brought Albert a pie almost every week through January and February, and he accepted each one with the quiet courtesy he extended to everything, and he ate them slowly over the course of several days, sitting at his counter under the green-shaded lamp, reading his book. In March, she did something she had not told anyone she was going to do. She drove to the offices of the community college on the south side of town, and she sat across from a woman in the development office, and she established a scholarship. The scholarship was for students entering the automotive technology program. It would pay for tuition, books, tools, and a small monthly stipend. It would be awarded each year to 2 students chosen by the faculty. It would be funded in perpetuity from the long-term account Margaret had set up. The woman in the development office asked Helen what she wanted the scholarship to be called. Helen had thought about it for weeks. She told the woman she wanted it called the Frank Whitfield Memorial Scholarship for Working Hands. The woman wrote it down. She did not ask Helen about Frank. She did not ask Helen what the funding source was. She asked only how Helen would like to be involved in selecting the recipients each year, and Helen said she would like to meet them. She met the first 2 recipients in August. They were both young men. One was the son of a single mother who had been working 2 jobs to support him. The other was the grandson of a man who had been a mechanic in this same town for 40 years and had retired 3 years ago. They sat across the table from Helen in a small conference room at the college, and Helen had brought a photograph of Frank with her, and she showed it to them, and she told them about him. She told them what kind of man he had been. She told them that he had not gone to college, that he had taught himself most of what he knew, that he had been better at his work than any man she had ever met. She told them what he had said, once, in a letter, about working with his hands. He had written, "You can lie with your mouth and you can lie with your money, but you cannot lie with a wrench. The thing either works or it doesn't." Both young men sat very still while she spoke. The grandson of the old mechanic, when she was finished, asked if he could keep the photograph. Helen said yes, and she gave it to him, because she had 3 more copies of the same photograph at home. She visited Frank's grave once a week. She brought flowers in the warm months and small evergreen branches in the cold ones. She talked to him sometimes. She told him about Margaret. She told him about Albert. She told him about the scholarship, and she told him the names of the boys who had received it. She told him about the tomato plants, which she had replanted that spring and which were yielding more than she could eat. She did not tell him about Robert. There was nothing to say about Robert that he had not already known. She did one more thing that winter. She took the notebook of names Frank had left in the desk drawer, and she began, slowly, one by one, to call the people on it. Not all of them. Not the lawyers or the investigators. She called the personal ones. The Navy friend Frank had described as someone he had trusted. The retired bank manager who had helped with the safety deposit box. The coin dealer in Cleveland who had sold Frank his first authenticated piece in 1995. The Navy friend lived 2 hours north, in a small town near the lake. His name was Daniel Hauser, and he was 71 years old, and when Helen called him, he was quiet on the line for almost a full minute before he could speak. He told her he had been waiting for her call for a long time. He said Frank had told him, 20 years ago, that if anything ever happened, Helen might want to know certain things, and Daniel had said yes. And that was the last they had ever spoken of it, and now here she was. He invited her up. She drove the following Saturday. Daniel lived in a small house on the edge of the lake. He met her at the door in a flannel shirt and a pair of jeans, and he had made coffee, and he had a photograph album on the kitchen table that Helen had never seen. Pictures of Frank when he was 19. Frank in uniform. Frank standing on the deck of a ship in the South China Sea. Frank laughing with 3 other young men at the rail of that ship, one of whom was Daniel, 2 of whom Helen would never meet because they had died in the years between. Daniel told her about the years before she had known Frank. He told her about the 2 men who had not come home, and what their deaths had done to Frank, and the way Frank had carried them for the rest of his life, without ever talking about them to anyone except Daniel. He told her about the night in Subic Bay when Frank had pulled him out of a fight that would have ended badly, and about the morning Frank had taken the watch of a sailor who was too sick to stand it, and about the way Frank had been, in those years before Helen, exactly the same kind of man he had been in the years after. Quiet, steady, unwilling to let anyone he loved be left in trouble. He used to talk about you, Daniel said. Even before he met you. He used to talk about the woman he was going to marry. He said he did not know what she looked like or where he was going to find her, but he said he knew certain things about her. He said she would be kind. He said she would be smart in a way that was not loud. He said she would have her own opinions about everything that mattered, and that she would not let him talk her out of any of them. He told me all of this when he was 21 years old. The first time he met you, he called me from a payphone at 3 in the morning. He said, "Daniel, I found her." Helen sat at the kitchen table of a man she had never met before, looking at photographs of her husband as a boy, and she understood that even her own marriage had been larger than she had known. Frank had been preparing for her, in some quiet way, long before he ever knew she existed. She drove home in the dark. The lake fell away behind her. She did not put on the radio. She listened to the hum of the truck's engine and watched the dashed white lines come at her through the headlights. And she thought about all the lives that had touched the life of her husband, and how every one of them had carried him forward without knowing it. Until the day he had walked into a diner at closing time with motor oil on his sleeve and ordered coffee black and apologized for being there so late. The bank manager she called the next week. His name was Walter Reed, and he was 83, and he lived in an assisted facility on the west side of the city. She brought him a tin of cookies. He held her hand in both of his when she sat down across from him, and he told her that Frank had come to him in 1995 to set up the safety deposit box at the small branch where Walter had managed for 30 years, and that Frank had told him in plain terms what he was doing and why, and Walter had told him that he understood, and Walter had quietly made sure, every year for the next 25 years, that no one at the bank ever paid any particular attention to the box or its contents or the man who came in twice a year to add to it. Walter had retired in 2018. Before he retired, he had personally trained the woman who would handle the box after him, a teller named Diane, and he had told her, without telling her why, that there was an arrangement to be respected, and Diane had respected it for the 7 years that followed. "I do not know what was in that box, Mrs. Whitfield," Walter said. "I never asked. Frank did not tell me, and I did not need to know. But I want to tell you something. In 41 years of working in banking, I never met a man more careful about the small details than your husband. He came into that bank on the same date every year. He brought the same envelopes. He filled out the same forms. He never said hello to me by name in front of any other customer because he understood that I had to treat him the way I treated everyone else. He was the most considerate customer I ever had. I do not know if he ever told you that I missed him after I retired. I missed him very much. Helen sat with him for an hour. They drank tea. She told him about the funeral and about the year that had passed and about the scholarship she had set up at the college. Walter listened to all of it, holding her hand for some of it, and when she stood to leave he asked if she would come back and visit him sometime. She told him she would. She kept the promise. She visited him every month for as long as he lived, which turned out to be another 2.5 years. The coin dealer in Cleveland she never called. She wrote him a letter instead, thanking him for the patience he had shown her husband over 30 years. He wrote back a long, careful response in which he told her that Frank had been one of the half-dozen most knowledgeable amateur numismatists he had ever known, and that the collection Frank had built was, in his professional opinion, not merely valuable in monetary terms, but exceptional in its taste. Helen read the letter twice. She put it in the wooden box with the others. She did not see Robert again for almost 6 months. When she finally did, it was at a grocery store, of all places, on a Thursday afternoon in early March. She had gone in to buy bread. She turned a corner into the cereal aisle, and Robert was standing there, holding a box of oatmeal, reading the side of it. He had not aged well in the years since she had seen him. He looked thinner. The skin around his eyes had a grayish cast that Helen recognized from her father in the months before his death. Robert saw her at the same moment she saw him. They stood at opposite ends of the aisle for perhaps 3 seconds. Then Robert set the box of oatmeal carefully back on the shelf and walked toward her. Helen did not move. She did not feel afraid. She felt nothing, exactly, except a small, clean curiosity about what he would say. He stopped a few feet from her. He looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the diamond ring on her finger. He did not look at her face. Helen, Robert, I owe you an apology. She waited. She had learned, in the years since Frank's death, that there was great power in waiting. People who had not waited their whole lives did not know how to do it. Robert was one of those people. He stood in front of her in the cereal aisle, holding the apology in his mouth like an object he did not know how to hand over. I made mistakes. After Frank died, I let Linda push me into things. I should not have done what I did. I am sorry. It was the smallest possible apology. It was the kind of apology a man gives when he has been told by his lawyer that giving it will cost him nothing. Helen understood that. And she understood that Robert understood that she understood it, and she understood that this was the only apology she was ever going to get from him in her life. She also understood, looking at the gray cast around his eyes, that he was an unhappy man, and that he had perhaps always been an unhappy man, and that his unhappiness was not her problem and never had been. Robert, yes. Frank loved you. Robert went very still. He did not look at her. He did. He told me so a long time ago. I do not know if he ever told you. I doubt that he did. He was not the kind of man who said those things out loud. But he loved you, and he was your brother for the whole time you knew him, and he never spoke a word against you in front of me, ever, in 31 years. I want you to know that. I want you to carry it with you. Take care of yourself. She walked past him. She did not look back. She finished her shopping. She paid at the register. She loaded her bags into the truck, and she drove home. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel sad. She felt the way she felt after she had finished a difficult task at the kitchen sink, which was that the thing had been done, and the thing did not need to be done again, and she could now move on to the next thing. Frank had told her in his letter to forgive him for what he had hidden. He had not told her to forgive Robert. She did not know whether she had forgiven Robert or not. She thought that it did not matter. Robert was no longer part of her life. Robert had stopped being part of her life on a Friday afternoon in Margaret Sullivan's office, when he had signed his name to a piece of paper and renounced his claim on a brother he had spent 30 years calculating the value of. The world was full of brothers. Helen had no use for that kind of one. In April, on what would have been their 32nd anniversary, she opened the last letter in the wooden box. She had been saving it. She had not wanted to read it until she felt strong enough. She thought, on that morning, that she finally was. The letter was dated October 12, 2024. 3 weeks before Frank had died. Helen, I think this is going to be the last one. I have been more tired this year than I have been before. I went to the doctor again in July, and he told me what I already knew, which is that the heart is not going to keep going much longer. I have not told you. I am not going to tell you. By the time you read this, you will know anyway, and it will not have helped you to know any sooner. I am sorry for that. I am sorry for a lot of things. I am sorry I could not give you the life you should have had. I am sorry I could not be the kind of man your family wanted you to marry. I am sorry I will not be there to make your coffee in the morning. But I am not sorry I married you. I have never been sorry for that. Not for a single day. Not for a single hour. I want to tell you what I want for you. In the time you have left after I am gone, I want you to take care of yourself. I want you to eat well and sleep enough and see a doctor when you need to. I want you to keep the house if you want to keep it, and to sell it if you want to sell it, and to do whichever one makes you happy. I want you to travel if you can stand to travel alone. You and I never had the money to go where you wanted to go, and now you will have the money, and I want you to use it. I want you to see the ocean. I want you to see the mountains in autumn. I want you to sit somewhere with a good cup of coffee and a view of something beautiful, and I want you to know that I am sitting next to you in some way I cannot explain. I want you to find someone to be kind to. I do not mean a man. I do not mean another marriage. I have known you for 31 years, and I know that part of your life is over and that you would not want it any other way. I mean someone who needs you, a young person who is starting out, a child who has lost what you have lost, someone whose life would be different if you were in it. The money is good, Helen, but the money is not the point. The point is what you do with it. The point is that I worked for 30 years to give you the choice, and the choice is now yours, and I trust you with it more than I have ever trusted anyone with anything. I want you to wear the ring. I want you to wear it every day. If you take it off to wash dishes, put it on the windowsill where you can see it, and put it back on as soon as your hands are dry. The ring is not the marriage. The marriage is over. The ring is the promise. The promise was that I would always try to be worthy of you, and I am still trying, even now, even after I am gone, even though I cannot do it in person anymore. Wear it for that. And finally, I want you to forgive me for what I had to hide. I hid the coins because I did not trust the world. I did not trust Robert. I did not trust the bank to give you what was yours. I did not trust anything except small, heavy objects made of silver and gold, sitting in a drawer in a man's shop on Adams Street, where I knew they would be safe until you needed them. I hid the letters because I was afraid that if I gave them to you while I was alive, you would think I was preparing to die, and I did not want you to live with that fear. I hid the doctor's appointment because I am a coward about some things, and that was one of them. I am sorry for the hiding. I am sorry I made you find everything alone. But Helen, you did find it. Every piece of it. Albert called me last winter and told me you had walked into the shop one Friday afternoon. I was sitting at the kitchen table when you came home. You did not say a word about it. You did not ask. I knew then that you had not yet found the note. I knew you would find it when you were meant to. And I knew, with the same certainty I have always had about you, that when you did find it, you would do what needed to be done. You have done it. I cannot see you doing it, but I know. The boys who write these letters are the same boys who read them at the end. I know what you are made of. I have known for 31 years. I love you. I have loved you the whole time. I will love you until there is nothing of me left to love with. And then I will love you a little longer than that, in whatever way is possible for a man to do anything when he is no longer alive. Wear the ring. Frank. Helen folded the letter slowly. She put it back in the wooden box with the others. She closed the lid. She set the box on the dresser where she had been keeping it. She walked to the bedroom window and looked out at the small backyard, at the tomato plants she had replanted, at the dogwood tree under which Murphy was buried, at the patch of grass where Frank had once taught her how to throw a curveball, badly, on a Sunday afternoon in 1996. She did not cry. She had cried enough. She stood at the window with her hand on the glass, and she felt the ring against the window pane, and she thought of him. A year after Frank died, Helen invited Albert Marlow to dinner. He came on a Saturday evening in early November, bringing a bottle of wine he had been saving. They ate at the kitchen table, the same table where Helen had found the yellow note. She had made a roast. She had made Frank's favorite pie, the apple one with the lattice crust he had loved since he was a boy. Albert ate slowly, the way he did everything, and he told her stories about Frank she had not heard before. The afternoon Frank had come into the shop with a black eye he refused to explain and had spent an hour helping Albert fix a broken display case. The Christmas Eve in 2008 when Frank had brought Albert a paper bag full of homemade cookies because Albert lived alone and had sat with him in the empty shop for 2 hours so that Albert would not have to start the holiday by himself. Helen listened. She felt, sitting across from this old man who had kept her husband's secret for 3 decades, that she was getting Frank back in pieces, slowly, The way a person assembles a broken thing on a workbench under a single hanging bulb. There would not be another Frank. There would not be a replacement. But there would be this. There would be these small, recovered pieces of him, brought to her by the people he had loved and who had loved him back, and she would put them together in the room of her own memory, and she would keep them there. After Albert left, Helen sat on the front porch in the cold for a long time. The stars were out. The street was quiet. A car passed once and then was gone. She thought about the woman she had been a year ago, the woman in the taped shoes and the second-hand cardigan, the woman who had stood in the kitchen with a yellow note in her hand and had not understood what it meant. She did not feel sorry for that woman. That woman had been Frank's wife. That woman had loved him and had been loved by him for 31 years. There was nothing in any vault, in any drawer, on any auction floor, that was worth more than what that woman had already had. But that woman had also been afraid. She had been afraid in ways she had not allowed herself to admit, afraid of the rent, afraid of the bills, afraid of the small running ledger of things she could not afford and would never afford. Frank had taken that fear away from her after he died. He had taken it away after 30 years of carrying it himself. It was the greatest gift anyone had ever given her, and she knew, sitting on the porch in the cold November dark, that she would spend the rest of her life trying to be worthy of it. She got up. She went inside. She locked the front door. She turned off the porch light. She walked through the house room by room the way she always did at night, checking the locks Frank had never had to teach her to check, because he had checked them himself for 31 years. She walked upstairs. She got ready for bed. She set the wooden box of letters on the nightstand where she could reach it. She lay down on her side of the bed. The pillow next to her was empty. It would always be empty. She had thought, in the first weeks after he died, that the empty pillow was a wound. She understood now that it was not. The empty pillow was a place that had been filled for a long time, and the shape of the filling was still in it, and the shape was the proof. The shape was what she had been given. The shape was what she had been left with. The shape was hers. She turned off the lamp. In the dark room, the diamond ring on her finger caught the small amount of light that came in through the window, and it shone faintly, the way a small thing shines when it is the only thing shining. And Helen Whitfield, who had been a waitress and a stock clerk and a mechanic's wife, and who was now, by the slow, patient labor of a man who had loved her, something new for which she did not yet have a word, closed her eyes and slept. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.